Howdy, folks. Just want to welcome you to today's session entitled Why Hyperautomation is the Key to Speed and Scale in Life Sciences R&D. Today's session is going to be presented by Dave Dorsett. He's the Chief Digital Officer here at Astrix. Thrilled to have Dave and his great insights on these topics today. A couple of quick things real quick. I just want to again mention, please ask as many questions as you want as we go through the session today. As we're going through, when we get to the end, we'll tackle as many questions as we can. If we don't get to your questions, we'll reach out to you one-on-one. And then early next week, you will receive a link to a recording of today's session, which will be hosted on the Astrix YouTube channel. And we would encourage you to subscribe to that to get alerts when new videos go live. So with that, let's go ahead and jump in and get started. Dave, we can go to the next slide, please. Before we get into today's content, I do want to take a moment and introduce Astrix and who we are. If you've never been into one of our webinars before, I'd like to welcome you. We're thrilled to have you. If you're coming back for a webinar again, we welcome you back. We're glad you found our last content compelling enough that you're going to join us again. So in terms of who we are, Astrix, for about 28 years now, we have been working as a technology and strategy consulting firm exclusively in the life sciences sector. And we bring a very specialized blend of strategic and technical services, processes, as well as a technology agnostic approach that's made us a leading partner in transforming the success of life science and science-based organizations, especially around things like digital transformation. And again, we've been doing this for over 28 years now. And one of the things we're extremely proud of is that over 90% of the large employee base here at Astrix all hold advanced science degrees. So we're very much a science-based company helping other science-based companies. So that's just a little bit about us. We'll dive into the content. I'd like to introduce our speaker. Again, Dave Dorsett's going to be speaking today. He's the Chief Digital Officer here at Astrix, and he brings over 30 years of experience in R&D informatics, a lot of it within the global pharmaceutical, chemical, and CPG industries. He's got a track record of architecting and designing commercial as well as in-house informatics systems, which span the entire R&D spectrum. So Dave brings a ton of experience, a ton of knowledge, a ton of insight. We're thrilled to have him, as always, present to you today. Dave, I'll pass it to you and I'll come back on at the end to help with questions.
Great, thank you very much. Hopefully everybody can hear me all right. So today, just a brief sort of overview of how we're going to tackle this topic. I'm going to give a little bit of background around hyperautomation. I'm going to focus in on three core principles with a little more detail than around sort of what it means to actually implement, execute, something that might fit into the hyperautomation sort of space. I'm going to take a little bit and talk a little bit more specifically about the role of AI ML, in this. I've got one example. We can discuss other ones as if questions actually come up, et cetera, and we'll do some Q&A towards the end. Please, at any point during this, if I'm saying something that you're interested in more elaboration on or have questions about, please log a question. That would be much appreciated. So let's just sort of start the overall definition of hyperautomation. So again, synthesis of AI, ML, RPA, real-time analytics, et cetera. And it's really sort of the next stage evolution of task automation, which is something that's been being practiced for quite a while now. We'll talk a little bit more as we go through this. It's really, this talk is really intended to cover some of the basis and some of the history around hyperautomation, what kind of things fit into this general category of approaches, and then examples of what you can actually do with it. So I guess my first question always, having been around this industry for quite a while, is when I hear new buzzwords. And I don't remember exactly when hyperautomation kind of entered my radar of buzzwords, but one of my initial questions is always, is this really a new thing, or are we actually sort of retreading old grounds? And I'll leave that to your I'll leave the answer to that to your judgment as we go through this a little bit. But the world of automation, quote unquote, process and task automation, et cetera, which we'll talk a little bit as we go through this, also known as orchestration, also goes by all kinds of other names, some of which you see here. This has been around for a while, so this goes back, quite a long time. And the idea here really is that how we may actually sort of hybridize a whole bunch of existing technologies, existing approaches, learn from them, learn how to do things better, iterate on this, and kind of, move the needle forward, I guess, if you will. Seems to me to be the, sort of the genesis behind the new buzzword being applied here. So all this past work is absolutely relevant when it comes to, anything today that might fit into the bucket of hyperautomation. And what we really want to try to do is build from the learnings of what has worked and also what hasn't worked with respect to all of these, older technologies, and actually sort of, again, make a substantial, set of new guidelines basically for how we can actually deal with new and challenging areas, like when it comes to a space like this. So I'm going to just pick out a couple of the building blocks, from that previous slide, which was not inclusive by any means. But I'm going to pick out a couple of the building blocks to talk a little bit more about, from a background kind of perspective. Many of you have probably heard the phrase RPA, the acronym RPA. This has been around since about the 2000s or so, robotic process automation. And this really sort of entered the world on the enterprise side of things, not so much in an R&D sense, but in an enterprise technology sense, around how to automate tasks that have strong rule structures or rule structures to them. So some of the examples of RPA, for example, would be encoding an invoice into a payment processing system to move the needle forward. It's basically the idea here with a lot of RPA was reducing human error, reducing human need for humans to do repetitive tasks that had low intellectual content to them, meaning that transcription is the best example of this. So if I'm transcribing materials, from one form to another form to simply enter data from some type of a form into another system, or from system A to system B, et cetera. These are things that were sort of ripe for robotic process automation. And we started doing a lot of this in the 2000s with, these are advanced macro sort of oriented systems. They do interesting things with screen scraping, so they can recognize tags basically, and figure out, oh, the name of the person goes into this control, et cetera. Some of the more sophisticated versions of this involve decision trees, like if you see this data, then do the following things, types of things. These are really emulating, like I said, low intellectual sort of processes in terms of like human interactions and such. These RPA systems, generally speaking, RPA per se, really struggled with complex tasks or variable task structures. Meaning that, as you got to more of the if it's this kind of a purchase, if it's more than this amount, then you got to do the following things. If it's, if it's actually some material, and we'll stick with the examples in the enterprise world of like purchasing and invoicing. If the product was shipped to or received from this country, then there are these other things that have to be done in terms of filling out customs declarations, et cetera, et cetera. So the more of those if-then types of things entered into the definition of the task, the more complex these things got, the more they had to be tested, the more possibly error-prone things were, and the higher, and they also, came to have a higher cost of maintenance. Just modifications to that, changes in the business rules meant, substantial ripple effect changes, et cetera. So RPA, by and large, is a successful, has been a successful application in terms of, improving operational efficiencies and cost structures and things like that, but mostly for strong repetitive task structures that fit within pretty simple, straightforward kind of rules and such, macro type thinking. Another relevant building block to the hyperautomation space is a set of words I'll call workflow orchestration. So this started in the 80s. This is where acronyms like BPMN and technologies like BPEL sort of play. Workflow orchestration are efforts, again, starting in the 80s and 90s. All these things are ongoing. Just the way I wrote this makes it seem like this wasn't used beyond the 90s, but workflow orchestration is very, very much in use today. It's a slightly different viewpoint. It's looking at sort of a business process and how to coordinate a business process that typically crosses multiple systems. And one of the classic examples of workflow orchestration in the enterprise world is onboarding an employee. So when somebody is hired into an organization, there's a whole set of interrelated things that need to be done. So the identity needs to be created for that person. They need to be put into appropriate mailing list groups. They need to be given system access to a variety of different systems that are related to their role. They need to be enrolled in training courses so that they can be, compliant with, with internal processes and internal regulations and all those types of things. So if you think about all the things that have to happen to onboard an employee, that's kind of an orchestration of an end-to-end business process. Crosses multiple systems. They all kind of have to be brought together in a whole set of things. There's also obviously, manager approvals and levels of oversight and reporting and all these things that happen as part of that. And so onboarding an HR employee is a good example of workflow orchestration. Again, these systems, rule-based business process management systems, kind of came about in the 80s, grew quite a bit during the 80s and into the early 90s. And these things are very widely used today. An R&D example of this type of thing actually would be a test request system. So a way by which I receive or have a set of samples that are created from a batch, or I have received accessioned from an external source, and I need a set of tests, a set of analyses prepared on these samples. So there's a lot of folks who have workflow orchestration systems that accept the high-level definition of the batches and the samples that are actually involved, and then the matrix of the tests that are actually required, and kind of orchestrate the flow of those samples and into various systems that would then be responsible for performing and executing those tests, excuse me. So that's an example of workflow orchestration in more of an R&D space. Challenges with classic workflow orchestration systems is, again, the real world is full of, and we're not going back to this topic, the real world is full of lots of unhappy paths, is the phrase I tend to use when I talk with people about these kinds of things. And encoding unhappy paths into orchestration systems, I mentioned how challenging it is to encode unhappy paths and variable paths and stuff into RPA, macro-oriented tools. It's still hard to do that in these workflow orchestration systems as well. So, actually going through the exercise of doing the analysis and diagramming out everything that has to happen when, let's say, the sample that was destined to be tested in this way on the way to that lab for this set of tests gets dropped, or wasn't stored in a way that's compatible with the storage requirements and therefore is no longer valid. All of those unhappy path things. What happens when the analyst who's supposed to be doing that work today is sick or leaves the company? All of the unhappy path real world things are challenges in applying workflow orchestration systems as well into these types of problems. So real world implementation complexity, change management. If a workflow orchestration system is talking to, I'll go back to the enterprise example. If the workflow orchestration system is talking to your identity management system, and also talking to, to a variety of different, like, again, role-based systems that a person might need access to, and trying to grant that access automatically. When you upgrade one of those systems, the workflow orchestration itself probably has to be touched. 9 times out of 10. You have to recode the orchestration system in order to do that. So change management ripple effects on these orchestration views is also a real world challenge in deploying orchestration systems. They're more flexible in general than RPAs, but they still suffer from a lot of changes. The third relevant building block for hyperautomation that I want to talk about today is process mining. This is a completely different. This is unlike the other two, but process mining, came about in the mid-90s. Kind of went through 5-10 years or so of development. It's still an ongoing area, and I'll come back to this actually towards the end in terms of future directions. But process mining is basically, the idea is, like, if you were able to look at the data of how people actually use systems, right, to engage in business processes. So if I were actually able to look at a high level as a laboratory scientist, as an analyst working in a lab, for example, at everything that I touch during a day, all the systems I use, where I've logged into, what I've done in all of these systems, be that the chromatography data system, for example, equipment, electronic equipment log systems to log, my daily use check. I go into the limbs, I do some other things. I may have recorded some sample workup kind of procedures in an ELN. You look at that whole ecosystem of what a person has done in a day, as speaking, in this case, as an example of an analyst. And I was able to peer into all the logs of all those systems. I might be able to build an interesting model of what is the analyst actually doing, right? A data-driven model, right? Not the kind of model that we build when we do requirements analysis, where we go in a room and we talk classically. We go in a room and we talk about what people do day to day, but actually one that's driven from the data itself. And if you do that on a broad enough scale, you imagine being able to look at the limbs and the electronic, log equipment log system and the ELN and all of these systems, and you look at what everybody is doing every day, and try to find common patterns of interaction. Gee, an hour after people use the ELN, there's this whole group of people that are in the limbs, entering test results. I wonder if there's a relationship there between in this bigger picture of a process, a model that says something about what to expect downstream of this kind of work. You're going to see this kind of work happen, more often than not. And this idea of process mining basically is that. How do we build a model of business processes, not from manual human-driven sort of requirements analysis, but actually by mining the systems themselves? And the interesting ideas on this is it could actually lead to insights into what's going on in the real world processes that might improve the usefulness of our systems. We could use them to actually iterate on the quality of our actual component systems. But the overall transparency and compliance and quality aspects of how systems are used could come to light through this kind of actual mining. And so there's a lot of interesting stuff. I worked with some, personally speaking, I worked with some interesting folks out of University College in London in the 90s, in the mid to late 90s, I believe it was, who were doing this sort of in and around sort of data analysis in the R&D space and the material science space and such. And some very interesting things kind of can pop out of this in this kind of approach. It's an interesting, relevant building block when it comes to these ideas around hyperautomation and how we can systematize the things that we do. One of the limitations of process mining has been, however, that by definition, you're looking at a data set that's telling you what people have done. It is past tense. And so there's a limitation in using a lot of this, that it is telling you about what is actually going on, not necessarily what could go on. It's not synthetic in the sense of the business process. I mentioned before that you can use it to iteratively improve your systems if you can realize some of these relationships, or realize how long it takes people to do certain tasks, and go to optimize individual tasks and systems with this. But it's not going to let you have the aha sort of out of the box moments around, gee, what if we completely re-streamlined or reinvented this process in a different set of systems? This is harder to use for that kind of a goal, right? So process mining is very instructive, can be very, very instructive in showing you things, showing you patterns and uses that you may not have seen otherwise, or may not have heard otherwise, but it is kind of limited, because it is post facto. It doesn't do a whole lot of creative stuff, that is one of the limitations. So these are some of the relevant building blocks to achieving these goals of hyperautomation that we chose before. And I've spoken a lot to this already, but all of this really, what we're trying to accomplish here by all of this, right? The goals of hyperautomation, as well as many other initiatives that I've spoken about in other webinars and other folks have spoken to as well, is what we're trying to do is make our scientific and our quality and our manufacturing processes more efficient, accurate, compliant, collaborative, transparent, valuable, and insert a whole bunch of other adjectives here, right? So we're all about trying to reimagine how we're actually executing work, right, in these spaces, how we're actually assessing the quality of drug product, how we're actually sort of optimizing the supply chain and the manufacturing use of materials, and how transparent our work actually is to others, how collaborative we can be in exchanging information. These are all very, high-level goals of many of our initiatives, in this space, and they definitely all apply to the hyperautomation, space as well. The challenges specifically from a process point of view, process automation kind of point of view, the hyperautomation aspects, is that the most valuable processes that we typically have in the scientific quality manufacturing space, they are inherently complex. They are variable. They have multiple overlapping definitions of success. Like, when is, we have some aspects of quantitativeness, to some things. Like we can put quantitative definitions on success. The outcome of the batch is a material that meets these testing that meets these tests within these limits. It's a great example of that, of course. But there's also variability to this sometimes, and there's this squishy world of exceptions, right? That's we tend to call them, and whether or not the exception is material or not is a very squishy, variable sort of world. I already mentioned the day-to-day unhappy paths that happen, right? Just routinely, right? In the human interaction with things, people are not, automatons. The variables around, anything that involves people, and all of these larger processes inherently involve people at some level, also introduces a whole lot of complexity. There's also a network effect that really happens when you start to chain things together. Complexity around automating a given system to perform a task, something like what RPA would be most centered on. As you add systems and try to chain systems together, you're in a space where every system, the connectivity between every system goes up, makes the complexity go up exponentially. 2 systems, you've got 1 coordination point, 1 handshake that has to be managed. 3 systems, you have at least 2 connection points. You may have 3 connection points if data gets carried from system 1 to system 3, et cetera, et cetera. So those network effects can creep in to play here when you're attempting in the definition of hyperautomation to apply these things to large business processes, and that is a huge complexity driver. To real world challenges, putting these kinds of things in place. Technical and organizational change management, those are large undertakings in sort of these processes world. And again, thinking out of the box can be very difficult. It's very easy to look at work we've done, look back at work we've done, how can we do it better? Actually truly transforming the work that's actually being done is a challenge, with all of these technologies and all these problems. I've spoken about a little bit already. Okay, that's the background. So what are some of the core principles of hyperautomation, at least from my perspective, and things that would fall into this bucket of being characterized as hyperautomation? So the first principle is that this is something that's driven by outcomes with an end-to-end thinking to it. So this isn't about a specific technology or so much of a task. So this isn't about, I'll go back again to that enterprise example. Well, I'll go back to the example of samples in a lab. The step of accessioning samples, so scanning a set of barcodes in from a bag of samples that have come in, via receiving, that's a specific task within an overall process, which isn't just about receiving the samples, it's about doing something meaningful from a scientific and business perspective with the samples, whether that be testing for their acceptability within a set of limits, or whether that be, returning a report, which is a conclusive analysis of the content or the properties of those samples. So hyperautomation is about outcome thinking, right? It's not about step thinking, right? It's end-to-end outcome oriented types of things. And that means it's not bound, within a specific technology typically. It's about business, science processes, quality processes, manufacturing processes. Another core principle of hyperautomation that I'll speak to a little bit is that achieving it requires, in my opinion, requires a disciplined and iterative approach. Okay, big bang attempts to to do things that would truly fall to being hyperautomation are almost certainly recipes to spend a lot of money and not move the needle. So truly achieving value out of a hyperautomation project requires a disciplined and iterative approach to doing this. Again, doing task automation, that's not the same as hyperautomation. Doing RPA, applying RPA task automation kinds of things, whether with RPA technologies or within intrinsic features and capabilities of the systems that we have, like LIMS systems and such, that is something that can be done sort of one shot. Okay, we can write a spec, we can write some requirements about how to automate sample accession. Okay, go forward and get that done as a single project, effectively. But achieving automation within the hyperautomation definition is, again, by definition, these are outcome-driven, end-to-end kinds of things, and their complexities mean that we need to actually be able to decompose them into steps that we can execute and then put into use and evaluate the use and then decide what the next step is going to be. I'll speak a little bit more about that in a bit. The third core principle of hyperautomation is that it is multidiscipline. And I kind of already touched on this, that those building blocks get combined here in kind of unique ways. And so it is a technical / domain / architecture kind of mindset that you have to bring to bear in a multidisciplinary way in order to proceed with these kinds of things. Okay, so talk a little bit more about driven by outcomes. In the R&D space, this is outcome-driven approaches to workflows. I use a phrase called workflow digitalization to apply to these. So this is really identifying digital workflows, so future states of how to actually execute end-to-end processes, outcome-oriented processes in a laboratory environment or a scientific or quality or manufacturing environment, about how do we improve the productivity of workers based on the full life cycle of the materials and data. So everything that's going on, looking for how do we actually improve the quality, efficiency, capacity of a lab, et cetera, in achieving the outcomes of a lab. So in the Astrix world, we do a lot of this type of analysis. It goes by a variety of different names: digital transformation, workflow digitalization, quote unquote lab of the future, types of things. We've done past webinars on how we do this type of analysis and the blueprints and the methodology that we apply to do this kind of work. And it is relevant here to the hyperautomation space because, again, you're trying to really focus on improving the outcomes, right, of a particular scientific or quality or manufacturing path. So it's not just about happy path. It's not just lifting and shifting manual processes or partially manual electronic hybrid processes into, electronic systematized ones. It's about actually reimagining the work in a more effective and efficient way, and restructuring that work. And doing this successfully requires the creation of an overall, I'll call it a data architecture. It's an approach to the data that actually then identifies, how and where the data is being created and updated and used in processes, and how data relates to outcomes, or how portions of the data relate to outcomes, and then how do we actually sort of harmonize and integrate, and provide governance around that data so that when we get ready to actually perform the outcomes, we're able to do that. It also requires addressing the flow of materials in conjunction with the data. In a lot of the R&D IT world, one of the critical gaps that I see happen quite a bit is inadequate attention being paid to the material flow in and around digitalization projects or digital transformation projects or reimagining workflow projects like this. We focus on systems, we focus on the CRUD, create, read, update, delete, the life cycle of data. We think about the point of view of the person creating the data, 99.9% of the time, and not the person using the data enough, and not the flows of materials that actually go with that. So there's a lot of workflow digitalization work that actually speaks to the material flow itself. Everything we do in this industry, in the process industries, is about making stuff. And so it's kind of obvious in that sense that we should be paying a lot of attention to the stuff that flows around, not just the data about the stuff. So outcome-driven approaches are required within hyperautomation kinds of projects. Again, you're trying to achieve a larger end-to-end types of benefits. So this is the way you need to think about, writing your requirements. Disciplined iterative approaches. The interesting thing here is that we get the proverbial eating your own tail kind of image here. When you start to transform processes, when you apply changes, transformative changes in the scientific workflows themselves to things, the goalposts move, meaning the fact that you've made a change changes a lot of times the rest of the process as well. So when you make a small set of changes, sometimes seemingly small set of changes to the overall processes, the whole downstream analysis of what would be the next most important thing to do can shift on you. So the side effects of introducing a new process in these spaces, means that your original assumptions, if you really look at it end to end and try to map out an entire project, become impacted by small changes that in a way that you may not, that's actually quite hard to predict sometimes. So this is the basis of my statement that you really have to do hyperautomation work or digital transformation work, by another name, in iterative, disciplined ways. Map out the whole thing to a reasonably good level of understanding, identify by priority where you might start making changes, work those changes out, put the changes into place, and then step back and observe and rethink what the impact of those changes have actually been before you blindly move on to the next step. Don't blindly move on to the next step. The ground moves beneath your feet when you start making changes in workflows and work processes, and you need to be able to step back and say, hey, what we thought we were going to do next is probably not going to give us the most value. What we really need to do next is this other thing over here. So that's the disciplined iterative approach aspects that I'm talking about. And that builds into the importance of a roadmap. So a roadmap with respect to hyperautomation or transformation processes tells you a little bit about what I'm trying to change and how I might measure that change and how I'm going to reassess that and run these iterations, right? And something about the ordering, if there's important dependencies in between things, right? You want to be able to capture that in your roadmap. But a roadmap is not a plan. A roadmap is not a Microsoft project, detailed Gantt chart with individual tasks and resource assignments and resource leveling and all the other things that happen in the project management space. It's not that detailed in terms of task timelines and resources. It's simply a visualization mechanism for helping manage the complexity while enabling the change. This is one of the core tenets of the challenge to people that want to play a role of an architect, whether that be a scientific workflow architect or a data architect or a systems architect or any of those things. The job requirement to me really comes down to, being successful at how you manage complexity. The types of complexity in those different types of architecture are different, but it's all about managing the complexity and how you actually structure layers of thinking and discipline around that stuff so you can make those changes, put those systems in place, put those new processes in place, and do that in sort of this overall viewpoint, you want to be successful, you want to take the trip, but what you're going to confront on every step of that trip, you're not going to be able to predict in advance. So you need the big picture to move on. Okay, so multidiscipline, well, the third principle. So we already talked about the tooling and the history of these kinds of things, and implementing anything that would fall into the hyperautomation category requires all these different kinds of components. And there's analogies that you can think of here about the things that you need if you're going to take a trip by car. You need fuel, your tires need to work, the engine needs to work, you got to have steering, and you can look at the different tools, some of which we already spoke about here. About how they might play individual roles, how their strengths and weaknesses can actually sort of work together. But hyperautomation is not about a technology. It's not about something you go and buy, right? And just, hey, I'm going to go buy the system and deploy it. I'm going to be hyper-automated. It doesn't work that way. We're talking about business processes here. We're talking about impact on outcomes. And the variables associated with those business processes and those outcomes are substantial. And it is this overarching, this big picture problem that you need to keep in mind. And you should expect that you're going to need to deploy and have in your toolbox a number of different tools in order to be successful. Now, the next part of this here, I'm going to move through quickly. I'm going to point back at a webinar from the past, actually, where Ken Raish, also of Astrix, he's VP of Client Success here, and myself spoke about Lab of the Future and part of the key industry trends. And we sort of pointed out some things that we saw, happening in the broader space of R&D and quality. And I'm just going to very quickly point out here some of these trends and vendors and technology sets, essentially, that are relevant around data orchestration. Spoke to some of this. I'm going to point out the same thing with data governance. This is another important part of anything that would be categorized as hyperautomation. The data is a critical part of things. So practical and pragmatic data governance and harmonization is an aspect of these kinds of projects. Data management technologies for dealing with, the variable structures of data that you're going to have to find out, find ways of handling in anything that's hyper automated. And then some bits are on AI ML as well. This last bit now, last part of the webinar here, I want to sort of speak to that in particular. A lot of folks out there distinguish hyperautomation from, as a new buzzword by the role of AI ML in this, right? So I wanted to just say a few words about the role of AI ML and some future directions, actually, that I think are interesting with respect to the space of hyperautomation. So we've got more or less established, and I would put established in quotes here, because this is obviously a rapidly progressing area. But we have some pretty well established, good success stories here and there about how using AI ML to making unstructured data available via categorization for analysis. OCR is an example of this. Voice recognition technologies, these types of things are examples of actually taking relatively unstructured data and breaking them down into some level of component structure or categorization that we could then put into decision making and sort of automate, use that contents in this mechanism to automate business processes. Pattern recognition and trending. So looking at large amounts of large past data, for example, to find, okay, I see something, we've seen something that looks like this before. So therefore we can guess that the following things with some probabilities are going to happen, and we can accommodate that in our effort to automate the end-to-end process here. So these are roles that AI ML can play within sort of some of the now actually within projects that are related to hyperautomation, and actually sort of how to better manage these end-to-end business processes. Going forward and some of the future stuff that's most interesting to me is the application of another buzzword, agentic AI, right? And the idea behind agentic AI, if you're not familiar with this particular buzzword, is that rather than today's typical AI ML, integration or usage patterns where I, write an explicit prompt. I write a statement, a goal, some form that I'm then feeding into a system, which then uses its knowledge base, et cetera, to be able to respond to me. Agentic AI, the idea is that, that it wouldn't have to respond to an explicit prompt. It can perceive the condition, it can perceive the state of what's actually happening, given a set of data, and then looking at that, make a decision and take autonomous action to achieve a goal. The best example of agentic AI and this autonomous action principle, which is the big difference between it and large language models, are self-driving cars. So that's a real picture of Waymo in San Francisco. I visited San Francisco a couple months ago, and these things are weird and they're wild and they're kind of all over the place. And when you see them go by, it's a little unnerving, a bit unnerving when you peer into the car and there's no one in the driver's seat. So that's a self-driving car. If you haven't been to San Francisco, that's one of the places where they're more in use than other folks. It's really interesting. It's obviously looks a little different than a standard car. It's full of sensors. It's full of data gathering techniques, essentially, which again are processed into pattern recognitions and into all this basis from which the car makes a decision and takes an autonomous action. It understands there's a pedestrian standing there, so I'm going to stop or I'm going to move out of the way, et cetera. So the best current example of agentic autonomous AI is self-driving cars. There are other applications of this where that are being used, that are being starting to roll out, and these are typically bounded by we've got available data that are fairly large and have some reasonable structure to them. So in IT processes like the help desk, I need a password reset, simple things like that. My VPN isn't working, those types of things. Customer service, computer security applications are really becoming very rapidly sort of a rapid fertile ground for the deployment of agentic AI, responding to security threats, basically. Applying agentic AI principles to R&D is something that's a lot of active exploration around. Some interesting things are going on in clinical trial surveillance and monitoring. About actually looking, using an agentic AI for observing a signal and taking an action, based on that. Process and equipment monitoring. Actually, predictive equipment monitoring is definitely, there's a lot of interesting things happening with predictive, maintenance schedules. And is this piece of equipment about to fail? Types of things. There's other interesting applications. There's a bunch of cool stuff that's actually come out in the last couple of months around structural property predictions in the material science space. This is like electronic materials, batteries, and solar materials, and chips, integrated circuits, around prediction of new novel materials and what those properties actually might be. So there's some really interesting stuff that's been done there. Like I said, to my knowledge, most of that publicly discussed, at least, has been in the electronic materials, and the general space of materials engineering. Drug target identification, there's been some interesting things happen in drug repurposing and examining information for looking for off-label applications of drugs and repurposing of drugs. So these are areas where agentic AI, and again, as a building block within hyperautomation, this idea, essentially agentic AI is almost, the idea of agentic AI is pretty much a synonym in many ways for quote unquote hyperautomation of a process, right? If you can program an AI, it would actually be the implementation of definition into what we've used exactly in terms of hyperautomation. So one last other quick example that we've worked somewhat in here at Astrix is actually an end-to-end process in iterating product formulation work. So actually sort of structuring the data and the data models, around the experimental work that's done to create product formulations, looking at the results of those formulations, automating the data flow, amongst all those things. So the batches, the preparation of the batches, the variability within the batches, the actual process information, the testing information on samples from the batches, bringing that all together, essentially identifying what attributes, then feeding those into AI/ML models for predictive purposes. These aren't fully agentic in the sense of taking the next step action. It'd be interesting to imagine, I mentioned before about the electronic materials sort of identification and property prediction. Those aren't yet wired up to like an automated lab synthesis, like taking the next step and saying, hey, I've got an AI taking the next step essentially. Hey, I've got an idea for a variation on a material here. Now I'm going to actually instruct robots in a lab to actually make this material and then loop back. So that's the stage where we're attempting to get to, from an industry point of view, in this. Okay, that's the end of my prepared content for today on this topic. It's a very broad topic, as you can kind of see. It brings together an awful lot of things, an awful lot of other buzzwords and a lot of other domains. And so, quite honestly, it was a little challenging trying to bring a picture together here that consumable in sort of a webinar format about what hyperautomation actually sort of means and what these types of projects actually might look like. And strong overlaps with Lab of the Future and digital transformation and a lot of AI ML and efforts as well. But hopefully this was helpful to folks to give sort of a little bit of a picture of where things stand, and I think where things are going, and some hints and suggestions about how you might think about these types of projects in your world. So thank you very much.
Great. Thank you, Dave. I appreciate that. Great content as always. For the folks that are on the call, I wanted to remind you that you're welcome to ask questions on the content that you just saw. I do have a couple of questions I want to get to. If you have something popping in your head, you want to ask it, now would be the time. I'm going to tackle as many of them as I can, so just bear with me 1 sec as we stop the recording.